Baku, 1903. A 2-year-old girl falls into the Caspian Sea. The man who pulls her out is 25 years old, wanted by the Tsar's police, already carrying a different name for every city he passes through. One day, the world will know him as Stalin. He wraps the child in his coat. He hands her back to her mother. 29 years later, she is found dead in a locked bedroom inside the Kremlin, a pistol beside her right hand. She was left-handed. Her name was Nadezhda Alliluyeva. She was the woman Stalin saved, and the only person, in the end, who was not afraid to tell him what he had become. This is her story. There is a story that the Soviet Union buried twice. The first time, they buried it in a coffin. On a cold November morning in 1932, in a cemetery reserved for poets and artists and the quietly remarkable dead. Not in the Kremlin walls where the powerful were supposed to go. Somewhere softer. Somewhere surrounded by writers. The second time, they buried it in a lie. They told the people of the Soviet Union that she had died of appendicitis. They told her own children the same thing. And for 10 years, the children believed it. Until one of them, a teenage girl, picked up an English-language newspaper by accident and read the truth in a foreign alphabet. Her name was Nadezhda Alliluyeva. She was 31 years old when she died. She was the second wife of Joseph Stalin. Welcome to Quiet Sovereigns. I am glad you are here tonight. This program tells the stories of the people who stood beside power. Not the ones who held it, but the ones who paid for it. The wives, the children, the quiet figures without whom history's most celebrated names would have been, perhaps, something very different. We tell these stories not as scandal and not as political analysis, but as what they are, human ones. Stories of love and its costs, of loyalty and what loyalty asks in return, of the particular loneliness that lives at the center of great power. Tonight's story is one of the strangest and most quietly devastating we have encountered. By every measure, Nadezhda Alliluyeva should not have married Joseph Stalin. She was 23 years younger than him. Her own mother opposed the match. She was a girl who had grown up believing in revolution, not in the man who would hollow it out. And yet she married him. In 1919, with no ceremony, no flowers, no celebration. Just a signature, and a life that began from that moment to slowly disappear. What makes her story different from the ordinary tragedy of a difficult marriage is this. Nadezhda Alliluyeva was not a passive woman. She was not someone who simply endured. She was educated, opinionated, possessed of a moral conscience that her husband neither shared nor tolerated. She went to university in her late 20s, taking the public tram from the Kremlin each morning, registering under her maiden name so that no one would know who she was. She had friends. She had convictions. She had, at one point, the ear of Vladimir Lenin himself. And when she began to understand, truly understand, what her husband's policies were doing to the people of the Soviet Union, she did not look away. That choice would cost her everything. Tonight, we go back to the beginning, to a seaport in the Caucasus in the summer of 1903, where a 2-year-old girl fell into the Caspian Sea. And we follow the thread of her life forward, through revolution and marriage and motherhood and disillusionment, to a locked bedroom in the Kremlin on the morning of November 9th, 1932. This is the story of Nadezhda Alliluyeva, the woman Stalin could not silence while she lived, and could not bring himself to forget after she was gone. Baku, 1903. The Caspian Sea in summer is flat and warm and the color of old bronze. On the stone embankment near the port, a family is walking. A Russian revolutionary, his wife, and their 4 young children. The youngest is barely 2 years old, a dark-eyed girl named Nadezhda. She toddles toward the edge, and then, in the way that small children do, without warning and without fear, she falls in. The man who pulled her out was 25 years old. He was already wanted by the Tsar's secret police. He went by many names, as hunted men do. But in the years ahead, the world would come to know him by one name above all others: Stalin. He had known the Alliluyeva family for years. They were Bolsheviks, like him. The kind of people who sheltered fugitives and passed messages between cells and never asked questions they didn't want answers to. Sergei Alliluyev, Nadezhda's father, was a railroad worker who had given his whole life to the revolution. His home, wherever it happened to be, Baku, Tiflis, St. Petersburg, was always open to men on the run. That afternoon on the embankment, Stalin wrapped the soaking child in his coat and handed her back to her mother. It was an ordinary act of rescue. No one thought much of it. No one could have known then what it meant. The Alliluyev household, in the years that followed, was a kind of underground railway station for the Russian left. Party members came and went. Papers were passed. Arguments about Marx and Plekhanov and the nature of historical inevitability lasted until 3 in the morning. And in the corner of these gatherings, a small, dark-haired girl sat and listened. Nadezhda was not, by all accounts, a timid child. She was curious and stubborn, and had what her daughter Svetlana would later describe as a southern appearance: the black eyebrows, the swarthy skin, the long, dry fingers that she seemed to have inherited from some gypsy ancestor no one could quite trace. She was the youngest of 4, and the one who watched the most. By the time she was a teenager, she had absorbed the language and the logic of revolution as naturally as other children absorb religion or music. It was simply the air of the house. The men who visited were not ordinary men. They were men who believed they were reshaping the world. And some of them, she could see, really were. Stalin visited the Alliluyev apartment in St. Petersburg during the years of his exile and escape, and rearrest and escape again. He was older than the other visitors, harder somehow. He had spent time in Siberia, real time, not the romantic political exile that some of the intellectuals romanticized over tea. He had survived things that left marks. According to family accounts, he was a man of tremendous personal magnetism when he wanted to be. He told stories. He quoted poetry. He had, when he chose to deploy it, a kind of focused attention that made whoever he was speaking to feel like the only person in the room. Nadezhda, growing up in a household that worshipped the revolution and the men who carried it forward, would have had no particular defenses against a man like that. She was 16 when the October Revolution came. She was working at the All-Russian Congress of Workers' Deputies, running messages, filing papers, doing the 1,000 small practical things that revolutions require and that history almost never records. Stalin arrived from exile. He had been gone for years. He was back now, and the revolution was real. And everything that the Alliluyev family had believed in for 2 decades had suddenly, improbably, come true. In the chaos and the exhilaration of those months, Nadezhda fell in love. It is not difficult to understand why. He was the hero of her childhood. He was the revolution made flesh, or so it seemed. She was a girl raised to believe that the revolution was the most important thing in the world. And here was the man who, more than almost anyone else in the room, had bled for it. She was not naive. This is important to say. The historical record, her letters, the memoirs of those who knew her, suggests a young woman of genuine intelligence and her own firm opinions. She did not love blindly. She loved, at 17, the way young people love when they have been raised to believe that ideas matter more than comfort. With her whole self, and with a certain reckless faith that the person she was choosing deserved that kind of love. She would spend the next 13 years learning what he actually deserved. They married in early 1919. Stalin was 40 years old. Nadezhda was 17, or perhaps just turned 18. The records are imprecise, which is itself a kind of detail. There was no ceremony. The Bolsheviks disapproved of religious customs, and Stalin had no patience for sentiment. A signature, a new apartment in the Kremlin compound, and a life, from that first morning, that belonged more to the revolution than to either of them. She went to work immediately, not as a wife, but as a party functionary. She became a code clerk in Lenin's personal secretariat, handling confidential communications for the man who was, in those years, the closest thing the Soviet Union had to a conscience. Lenin liked her. He was patient with her spelling mistakes, which were frequent. She had left school young, and the gaps showed. He told her it didn't matter. That patience, those who knew her said, meant a great deal to Nadezhda. Stalin did not share it. From the beginning, he wanted her at home. He wanted her available, domestic, orbiting his needs rather than her own ambitions. When she was expelled from the Bolshevik Party in 1921, ostensibly for neglecting her party duties during the chaos of new motherhood, Stalin did not fight for her reinstatement. It was Lenin who intervened on her behalf. It took 3 years for her full party membership to be restored. She noticed. She kept her maiden name in all professional contexts. She insisted on working even when it was inconvenient, even when Stalin resented it. She refused the state limousine that came with her position as the general secretary's wife, preferring to take the tram. These were not the gestures of a woman who had surrendered, but they were also not enough. In 1921, their son Vasily was born. In 1926, their daughter Svetlana arrived. Shortly before Svetlana's birth, Nadezhda wrote to a friend, a letter that survives only in fragments. She wrote that she was sorry to have tied herself again to new family obligations. Not angry, not bitter. Sorry. It is the word of a woman who is watching something. Her freedom, herself, the version of her life she had imagined, slip away, 1 year at a time. She was 25 years old, and somewhere in Siberia and the Caucasus and the Kremlin conference rooms and the dachas on the Black Sea coast, the man she had married was becoming something that the girl on the Baku embankment could not have predicted, and would not, for a long time, allow herself to fully see. The apartment they gave her was inside the Kremlin walls. Not the Kremlin of postcards and tourist photographs, not the gilded domes and the red stars. The residential Kremlin was a different place entirely, a compound of old Tsarist buildings converted into party housing, drafty in winter, watched at all hours, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors and thick enough to make you feel entombed. Guards stood at the gates. Guards stood in the corridors. The Politburo men and their families lived on top of each other, in a proximity that was intimate and, for most of them, quietly unbearable. Nadezhda moved in as a teenager and would not leave for the rest of her life. She tried to keep things simple. The accounts that survive, from party members who visited, from her sister-in-law, from the domestic staff, describe an apartment that was deliberately spare. No luxury, no excess. Nadezhda dressed plainly and refused the privileges that came with her position. When other wives of Politburo members wore silk and ate from special allocations, she continued shopping at the ordinary state stores. She is said to have controlled the family's finances carefully, budgeting the way her revolutionary parents had taught her, as though abundance were something to be suspicious of. She was trying, in the ways available to her, not to become what the place was turning everyone else into. It did not fully work. It never could have. Because the Kremlin in those years was not merely a residence. It was an ecosystem. And ecosystems reshape everything that lives inside them. The marriage, from the outside, looked like a partnership of the revolution. Two Bolsheviks, building the new world together. Stalin rising through the party hierarchy, accumulating power with a patience and precision that his rivals consistently underestimated. Nadezhda at his side, at the dinners, at the dacha weekends on the Black Sea coast, at the interminable evening gatherings where the Soviet elite drank Georgian wine and argued and laughed and watched each other with the specific wariness of people who understood that the political winds could shift overnight. From the inside, it was something else. Stalin was not a cruel husband in the way that word is commonly understood. He did not, so far as the historical record shows, strike her. What he did was harder to name, and in some ways harder to survive. He was contemptuous. He was dismissive. He treated her intelligence as a minor inconvenience, and her opinions as something to be managed rather than engaged. He conducted affairs. Polina Zhemchuzina, who was Nadezhda's own closest friend and the wife of Molotov, later described the marital atmosphere as one of constant strain, of arguments that broke out without warning and subsided without resolution. Karl Pauker, head of Stalin's personal security, was frequently an unwilling witness to their quarrels. He had no choice. The apartment was not large, and Stalin's rages were not quiet. According to Nadezhda Alliluyeva, who wrote about her parents' marriage with the particular clarity of someone who had spent decades trying to understand it, Stalin would sometimes beat on the bathroom door during their fights. He called her a fool. He went nights, then weeks, sleeping at the dacha at Zubalovo rather than coming home. Nadezhda did not, as far as anyone who knew her could tell, simply accept this. She wrote letters, to Stalin when he was away at the Black Sea, to friends, to family. Some of these letters survive, in fragments, in archives. They show a woman who was alternately affectionate and exhausted, tender and furious, capable of writing cheerfully about domestic details, and then, in the next paragraph, saying something that cuts through everything. In one letter to a friend, written in the summer before Svetlana's birth, she described being sorry to have tied herself again to new family obligations. In another, written to Stalin himself during a summer separation, she mentioned something funny Molotov had said, then asked when he was coming home. Then didn't ask again. She knew better than to ask twice. The summers were, by all accounts, the worst. Stalin went to the Black Sea resorts, to Sochi, to Abkhazia, the old Tsarist holiday grounds that the revolution had redistributed to its victors. He went for weeks at a time, sometimes months. He wrote letters back. The letters that survive, addressed to Tatochka, his pet name for her, have a warmth that is almost startling given everything else. He sent photographs. He made small jokes. He described the sea. Nadezhda wrote back. Her letters from this period describe a woman managing two small children, a party career she was trying to hold together, a social life that consisted almost entirely of the wives and families of the men her husband worked with. She took the children to the dacha at Zubalovo. She worked on her party duties. She waited. By 1929, she had apparently decided she was done waiting. Not done with the marriage, not yet, but done with the slow disappearance of herself. That year, at 28 years old, she applied to enroll in the Industrial Academy in Moscow. It was a school for the training of technical specialists, engineers, chemists, people who would build the infrastructure of the new Soviet state. She applied to study synthetic fibers. She was accepted. She registered under her maiden name, Alliluyeva, not Stalin. Every morning, she took the public tram from the Kremlin to the academy. She sat in the same classrooms as students from across the Soviet Union, from Ukraine, from the Caucasus, from Siberia, from the collective farms. She attended lectures. She studied. She was, at the Industrial Academy, simply a woman among other women and men who were trying to learn something useful. For the first time since 1919, she was somewhere that had nothing to do with him. This arrangement, it should be said, annoyed Stalin considerably. He wanted her home. He said so. She ignored him. She continued going. The domestic staff reported that she and Stalin fought about it, one of the ongoing arguments that never fully resolved, that went underground for weeks and then surfaced again without warning. She kept going to the tram stop every morning. She kept carrying the canvas bag. She kept signing in as Alliluyeva. It was a small act of preservation. She could not have known then what the academy would teach her. She had enrolled to become an engineer. She would emerge as something else entirely. A woman who had, finally and irreversibly, seen what she could no longer unsee. But that awakening was still ahead. In the late 1920s, she was simply a wife who had found a tram and a classroom, and an hour each day that belonged only to her. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. But it was something, and she held on to it with both hands. Meanwhile, in the conference rooms and the party corridors and the dachas on the Black Sea, Joseph Stalin was beginning to move the machinery that would change everything. Not just for the Soviet Union, but for Nadezhda herself. The collectivization of agriculture had begun. The kulaks were being liquidated. The granaries were being emptied. And every morning, on the public tram, his wife rode toward the people who would tell her what that actually meant. The tram to truth. The tram left the Kremlin gates at the same time each morning. Nadezhda was usually among the first to board. She carried a canvas bag, textbooks, notes, the kind of ordinary academic weight that she had never had the chance to carry as a young woman. She wore a plain coat. She sat near the window. The city moved past her in the early light. The gray facades, the factory chimneys beginning to breathe. The workers already at the tram stops with their own bags, their own destinations. Their own mornings that had nothing to do with the Kremlin or the Politburo or the man whose name she had quietly declined to use. She was, on that tram, no one in particular. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that image, once you know how her story ends. A woman in her late 20s, riding public transit through Moscow, pretending, or perhaps not pretending at all, perhaps genuinely inhabiting, a version of herself that had not been consumed by proximity to power. She had fought for this. She had enrolled over Stalin's objections. She had chosen the name Alliluyeva over the name that could have opened any door in the Soviet Union. Because she had understood, in some deep and wordless way, that a door opened by that name would not be hers. The Industrial Academy was not a glamorous institution. It was practical, utilitarian, the kind of place where the revolution's second generation came to learn how to build things. Synthetic fibers, chemical processes, the technical infrastructure of a modernizing state. The students came from everywhere, from the cities and from the countryside, from Ukraine and Georgia and the Caucasus and the remote agricultural regions of Siberia. Some of them had just come from those regions. Some of them had left families behind in places where what was happening was not, as the official newspapers described it, a triumphant reorganization of the rural economy. It is not entirely clear precisely when Nadezhda began to understand what her classmates were telling her. What we know is this. By 1931 and into 1932, students at the Industrial Academy were arriving from regions in the grip of a catastrophic famine. The collectivization campaign, the forced consolidation of peasant farms, the grain quotas enforced at gunpoint, the confiscation of seed stock, was killing people in numbers that the Soviet state was working very hard not to publish. She was sitting in classrooms with people whose families were among them. Imagine, for a moment, what that is like. You have spent your entire adult life in the Kremlin. You have attended the dinners, the parties at the dachas on the Black Sea, the evenings where the magnates and their wives ate and drank and argued about films and literature and the technical requirements of the 5-year plan. The word collectivization has been a word in your home, at the dinner table, in the reports your husband brings back from meetings, in the newspaper that arrives each morning with its clean, triumphant headlines. You have heard the word hundreds of times. You have never heard what it sounds like from the other side. And then one afternoon, in a classroom that smells of chalk and damp coats, a student from Ukraine sits down beside you. She tells you something, quietly, the way people tell you things that they are not entirely sure they are allowed to say. She tells you about her village. She tells you what she saw before she left. The swollen bellies, the empty granaries, the party officials who arrived in cars and counted the grain and drove away again with it. The children. You go home on the tram. You sit at the dinner table with your husband. He passes you the bread. We do not know the precise moment at which Nadezhda Alliluyeva understood that what her classmates were describing was not an exception, not a local failure, but policy. That the hunger was intentional, or at minimum, indifferent. That the grain was being taken and the deaths were being absorbed as a cost that someone, somewhere, had decided was acceptable. What we know is that she confronted Stalin about it. The accounts differ in their specifics, as accounts of private conversations always do. But multiple sources confirm the essential fact. Nadezhda argued with Stalin about collectivization and the famine. She told him what she was hearing. She pushed back. According to some accounts, he responded by having her friends from the academy arrested. The particular cruelty of that response, not argument, not explanation, but punishment of the people who had dared to tell his wife the truth, is its own kind of answer. She kept going to the tram stop. She was weeks away from finishing her degree. She had worked for 3 years toward it, had fought for the right to pursue it, had ridden that tram every morning through Moscow winter and Moscow spring and Moscow's brief, luminous summers. She was not going to stop now. But something had already stopped, somewhere inside her, that could not be restarted. The woman who had fallen in love with the revolution in 1917 had done so because she believed the revolution was good, because she had watched the men who carried it and decided, in the way that young people decide things, that they were worth following. 15 years later, she was sitting in a classroom with the people the revolution had decided were expendable. And she was married to the man making that decision. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from understanding what you were wrong about. It does not arrive all at once. It accumulates, in small moments, in conversations, in the specific texture of a husband's silence when you tell him something he does not want to hear. It is the grief of revision, of having to go back through your own history and understand it differently. Nadezhda Alliluyeva, in the autumn of 1932, was deep inside that grief. She had not said everything she needed to say. She was still trying, still pushing back through the channels available to her, which were, by now, very few. There was one left. She was going to use it at a party. She marched in the November 7th parade that year, the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution, alongside her fellow students from the Industrial Academy. She walked through Red Square while Stalin and their children watched from the top of Lenin's mausoleum. She waved. He watched. That evening, they would both attend a dinner at Voroshilov's apartment in the Kremlin. It would be the last evening they shared. By the time she boarded the tram the following morning, if she had boarded it, if things had gone differently, if the dinner had ended without what it ended with, she would have been only a few weeks from her graduation. She had almost made it to the other side of something. She had almost become the engineer she had enrolled to become. Almost. By the autumn of 1932, Nadezhda Alliluyeva had stopped sleeping well. This is not a figure of speech. The accounts that have come down to us, from domestic staff, from family members, from the close friend who walked beside her on the last night of her life, describe a woman in the final weeks before her death who was visibly exhausted. Not from overwork, though she was working hard. Not from illness, though she was not well. From something that has no precise medical name. The particular fatigue of a person who is carrying knowledge they cannot put down, and cannot share with anyone who has the power to change it. She was 31 years old. Outside the Kremlin walls, the Soviet Union in 1932 was entering what historians would later calculate as the worst year of a catastrophe that was still accelerating. The forced collectivization of agriculture, the policy her husband had designed and driven and defended against every voice that raised an objection, had produced a famine of staggering scale. In Ukraine alone, millions were dying. The grain quotas continued to be enforced. The seed stock continued to be confiscated. The bodies continued to accumulate in villages that the Soviet press had decided did not exist. Inside the Kremlin walls, they were planning the 15th anniversary celebrations of the October Revolution. This was the specific nature of Nadezhda's torment in that final year. Not that she lived alongside suffering, which most people do in one form or another, but that she lived inside the institution that was producing it. She ate dinner at a table where the famine was a policy outcome rather than a human fact. She attended parties where the men who had signed the orders arrived in good suits and talked about literature and cinema and the technical achievements of the 5-year plan. She slept, when she slept, in an apartment inside the walls of the same compound where those orders had been written. And she had a husband who had no interest, and increasingly no patience, for what she was trying to tell him. A few days before her death, she reportedly told a friend that nothing made her happy. Least of all, she said, her children. It is a brutal thing to say about one's own children, and historians have handled it carefully, uncertain whether it was a statement of genuine feeling or an expression of something closer to despair, the kind of utterance that comes not from coldness, but from a person who has lost their ability to feel anything through the numbness. Svetlana, who was 6 years old at the time, would grow up without a clear memory of her mother's face. Vasily, her son, would drink himself to death in his early 40s. Their mother's unhappiness, it seems, was not invisible to them, even if they were too young to name it. Nadezhda had tried, in the years of her marriage, to be a good mother in the terms available to her. She wrote to Vasily when he was away. She worried about Svetlana's education. She had insisted, over Stalin's preferences, that the children have some semblance of a normal life. These were not the gestures of a woman who did not love her children. They were the gestures of a woman who understood what the Kremlin did to the people who grew up inside it, and was trying, with the limited leverage she had, to protect them from it. By the autumn of 1932, that leverage had nearly run out. She had considered leaving him. Her nephew, Alexander Alliluyev, later claimed that in the period shortly before her death, she had been planning to leave Stalin again. There are no letters to confirm this. What we have instead is the pattern. The accounts of multiple occasions over the years when she had reportedly contemplated walking away, followed each time by a return that was more resignation than reconciliation. Leaving Stalin in 1932 was not a simple matter of packing a bag. He was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He controlled the apparatus of the state, the housing allocations, the food distribution, the employment records of everyone she knew. A woman who left Joseph Stalin did not simply go to a different city and start over. She became a problem to be solved. And the people who stood close to her became problems by association. She understood this perfectly. She was not an innocent. She had grown up inside the revolution, and she knew how the machinery worked. Which means that what she chose instead was not passivity. It was something else, something harder and more deliberate. She could not leave. She could not be silent. The only space remaining between those two impossibilities was a very small one, and she occupied it with what she had. Her voice, her presence, her refusal, even in the formal social rituals of the Kremlin elite, to behave as though everything was fine. In the weeks before November 8th, she prepared for the anniversary celebrations with what the people around her described as a kind of grim composure. She participated in the November 7th parade, walking with her classmates from the Industrial Academy through Red Square. She looked up at the mausoleum where her husband stood watching. On the evening of November 8th, she dressed carefully. She chose a black dress, and she pinned in her dark hair a single red rose. It is such a small detail, the kind of thing that would mean nothing in any other story. But in this one, it has accumulated an almost unbearable weight in the decades since. People who were there that evening remembered the rose. A woman in a black dress, a red rose in her hair, walking into the last room she would ever walk into as the person she had spent 13 years trying to remain. The dinner was at Kliment Voroshilov's apartment in the Kremlin. 300 people. The inner circle of Soviet power, the magnates and their wives, and the specific atmosphere of those gatherings, which was simultaneously festive and terrifying, where everyone laughed at Stalin's jokes and watched each other from the corners of their eyes. Stalin sat across from Nadezhda. At some point during the evening, he raised his glass and shouted across the table at her, loudly enough to be heard, which was the point. Which was always the point. "Hey, you! Have a drink!" Not her name, not her title, not even an acknowledgement that she was a person with a name. sitting across from him in a room full of people who were watching. She stood up. "Don't you dare hey me!" And she walked out. Polina Zhemchuzhina, Molotov's wife, the closest friend Nadezhda had inside the Kremlin, followed her out of the dining room. According to Svetlana's account, drawing on what Polina told her years later, they walked together through the cold Kremlin night, talking. What they said to each other, no one recorded. Polina was the last person to speak with Nadezhda Alliluyeva while she was alive. She walked Nadezhda to the door of the apartment in the Poteshny Palace. She said goodnight. She turned back toward the party. Inside the apartment, something happened that has never been fully explained. Nobody heard the shot. This is the first thing to understand about the night of November 8, 1932. The apartment was inside the Kremlin. There were guards in the corridors, guards at the gates, guards whose entire professional existence was dedicated to the awareness of every sound and movement within those walls. And nobody heard the shot. Or nobody said they heard it. She had asked her brother Pavel sometime before that night to give her a pistol. Pavel Alliluyev was a military man, and the request was not in itself unusual. He gave her a small Walther pistol. She locked the bedroom door behind her. She did not call for anyone. She did not leave a light on in the hallway. She simply went into the room and closed the door. And the Kremlin went on around her. The guards at their posts, the last guests leaving Voroshilov's apartment, the cold November wind coming off the Moscow River. In the morning, the housekeeper came to wake her. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Silence. She opened the door. Nadezhda Alliluyeva was on the floor. The pistol was beside her right hand. She was left-handed. That detail, the gun beside the right hand of a left-handed woman, has haunted this case for 90 years. Those who believe she was murdered point to it as evidence of staging. Those who believe she died by her own hand suggest it proves nothing. The doctor who performed the secret autopsy, his report is preserved in the State Archive of the Russian Federation, noted the cause of death as a gunshot wound. That doctor was executed not long afterward. Whatever he knew or suspected or had written in margins that were never preserved, he took with him. The Soviet Union, when it announced Nadezhda Alliluyeva's death in Pravda on November 10th, said she had died of appendicitis. This was the story given to the Soviet people, to foreign journalists, to the party faithful who had seen her marching in the parade 3 days before. It was also the story given to her children. Svetlana was 6 years old. Vasily was 11. They were told their mother had died of a sudden illness, the way children are told things that adults have decided they cannot yet understand. Svetlana would not learn the truth for 10 years. She discovered it by accident, reading an English-language publication which mentioned, in passing, the real circumstances of her mother's death. She was 16, sitting somewhere with a foreign newspaper, and the world she had understood rearranged itself around a single sentence in a language she was still learning. She had left a note. Svetlana Alliluyeva wrote about it in her memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend, published in 1967. She had never seen the note herself. Stalin had it. What she knew of its contents came from what others had told her over the years. From her nurse, from Polina Zhemchuzhina, from the fragments of conversation that survivors allowed themselves to have about a subject that was, for decades, almost entirely forbidden. The note, Svetlana wrote, was full of reproach and accusations. It was, she said, partly personal and partly political. Stalin destroyed it. We do not know what it said. We will never know. Whatever Nadezhda Alliluyeva had been unable to say at the dinner table, whatever she had written in the hours between leaving the party and the morning the housekeeper knocked, it exists now only in the description of a daughter who never read it, preserved in a memoir written 35 years after the fact, in a foreign country, by a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to understand what had happened in that locked bedroom. It is one of the great silences of the 20th century. Stalin was told the news by telephone early in the morning of November 9th. The accounts of his reaction differ. Svetlana's account says that he approached the open coffin at the funeral and pushed it away from him. That he said, in the hearing of those nearby, "She left as an enemy." Molotov, who was also there, remembered it differently. He told his own biographer that Stalin approached the coffin with tears in his eyes, that he stood there in silence, that he was, in those moments, something that he almost never allowed himself to be in public, a man who did not know what to do. Both versions may be true, both versions may be false. What we know is what Stalin said to his relatives, approximately 2.5 years after her death, when the first shock had passed and the grief had curdled into something else. "She did very badly. She crippled me for life." Not, "I failed her." Not, "I drove her to it." Not even, "I miss her." She did very badly. She crippled him. The death of his wife, in the grammar of the man who had caused it, was something she had done to him. The funeral was held on November 11th. The procession moved 6 kilometers through the streets of Moscow, from GUM department store to the Novodevichy cemetery. Not the Kremlin wall, where the powerful were supposed to go. Novodevichy, where the artists and writers and quietly remarkable people were buried. She ended up where she belonged, among the people who had made things, rather than the people who had commanded things. Between 1933 and 1941, the 9 years following the death of the woman who had dared to push back, 19 million Soviet citizens were arrested. 7 million of them died. She had been the last person inside the Kremlin who told him no. The Novodevichy cemetery in winter is very quiet. It sits on a bend of the Moscow River, surrounded by the old convent walls, and in November, when the trees are bare and the ground is beginning to freeze, it has the specific stillness of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human grief over a very long time. The graves of writers and composers and scientists fill the paths between the bare birches. People come here to remember. They bring flowers sometimes and stand for a moment, and then walk back through the gate into the city. There is a grave near the south wall with a marble face above it, a young woman carved in stone. The features are idealized, too smooth, too peaceful, the way monuments always make their subjects into something they were not. But the face is hers. According to those who were there in the years after 1932, guards, groundskeepers, the kind of witnesses who notice things that are not meant to be noticed, Stalin sometimes came here at night, alone, no entourage, or nearly none. He would sit beside the grave for a while, in the dark, and then leave. No one recorded what he said, or whether he said anything at all. We do not know if this is true. The story has the texture of legend, but it has been repeated by enough people across enough decades that it has earned a kind of weight, a haunting, if not a certainty. If it is true, if Joseph Stalin, the man who signed the death warrants of millions, who called her departure an act of treachery, who burned the letter she left him. If that man sat alone in the dark beside her grave, then we are left with a portrait of something almost too strange to hold. A man who could not be reached by the suffering of strangers, reached at last by the suffering of one specific woman. A grief that arrived too late to be of any use to her, or to the 19 million people arrested in the years that followed. She had been the last person who told him no, and when she was gone, there was no one left to tell him anything. Her daughter Svetlana left the Soviet Union in 1967. She walked into the American embassy in New Delhi and asked for asylum, carrying almost nothing. She published her memoir that same year. She changed her name. She spent the rest of her long and restless life. She died in 2011 at 85, trying to become someone other than Stalin's daughter. She mostly succeeded. She never entirely did. She took her mother's name, Alliluyeva, the same name that Nadezhda had written on the registration form at the Industrial Academy in 1929, when she had ridden the tram across Moscow and sat in a classroom among ordinary people and tried, for a few hours each morning, to be no one in particular. It is the name that survived, not Stalin, Alliluyeva. Her son Vasily drank himself to death in 1962 at 40 years old. Her brother Pavel died in 1938 under circumstances that were never explained. Her sister Anna spent 10 years in Soviet detention. The family was consumed, piece by piece, by the machinery of a man who had once pulled a 2-year-old girl out of the Caspian Sea and handed her back to her mother. The marble face at Novodevichy looks out over the cemetery with closed eyes. The inscription is simple: her name, her dates. Nadezhda Sergeyevna Alliluyeva, 1901 to 1932. No title. No mention of the man she was married to. No mention of the revolution she believed in, or the academy she almost graduated from, or the tram she rode every morning through a city she could not save. Just her name and the years. 31 years. A childhood in a household that believed the world could be remade. An adolescence in a revolution that remade it. A marriage to the man who remade it again, in ways she had not agreed to and could not forgive. A decade of small resistances, the maiden name, the tram, the classroom, the 3 words at the dinner table, and then a locked bedroom, and a morning when no one heard anything, and a letter that was burned before anyone else could read it. The Caspian Sea is still there. The seaport at Baku is still there. The stone embankment where a 2-year-old girl fell in, and a young man pulled her out and handed her back to her mother. That moment happened, and it cannot be undone. He saved her life, once, and she spent the rest of it living with the consequences. In the end, she used what remained of it to say the only true thing left to say. The letter is gone. The rose is gone. The tram line has changed. The academy is gone. The Kremlin apartment where she lived for 13 years has been repurposed and repainted and inhabited by other people with other stories. Only the grave remains, and the name above it, Alliluyeva.